I am Alan Walker, host of this podcast. I am on the board of the Twin Cities Creation Science Association. Thank you to Dr. Ross Olson for setting up the podcast, and Ryan Pickett, who will be doing the editing and posting on YouTube and Rumble. Our guest is Dr. Tim Clary from the Institute of Creation Research. He's a popular speaker and a research scientist. He presented The Truth of the Global Flood, an explanation of the global geological data to the Twin Cities Creation Science Association on August 17th, 2021. In that presentation, Dr. Clary showed how sedimentary evidence across several continents confirms the occurrence of a global flood. He presented oil industry data compiled into maps and diagrams that illustrate the progression of the flood and match what the Bible says in Genesis. This abundant evidence supports a worldwide flood that happened just thousands of years ago. This presentation is available on TCCSA YouTube and Rumble and has already received a lot of views. Dr. Clary has recent articles on this subject in peer-reviewed Creation Research Society Quarterly, that's the spring 2021 edition, and the August 2021 Acts and Facts from ICR. He has 3 recent books, Carved in Stone, Dinosaurs, Marvels of God's Design, and he's a co-author of Creation Basics and Beyond, all published by Institute for Creation Research. A little background on Dr. Clary. He received 2 masters, a Master of Science in Geology from the University of Wyoming, a Master of Science in Hydrogeology from Western Michigan University, and his PhD in Geology from Western Michigan University. From 1984 to 1992, Dr. Clary worked as an exploration geologist for Chevron USA, developing oil drilling prospects and analyzing assets and lease purchases. He was also a full professor and geosciences chair at Delta College in Michigan for 17 years before leaving in 2013 to join the science staff at the Institute for Creation Research. Let's begin with our first question. Dr. Clary, how does exploration in mining and energy relate to the Dominion mandate?
Well, that's an interesting question that I get once in a while, fairly often. And I think a lot of it has to do with, we were instructed by God to fill the earth, and we fill the earth, and he provided a lot of resources for us, even through the chaos of the flood. And we'll get back to this maybe in another question coming up, but he provided, in my opinion, a lot of it is providence, even through the judgment and the chaos of the flood, destroying, mankind for its wickedness, and, a lot of the animals as well, but yet preserving Noah and the other animals, 2 of every kind on the ark. He provided all these resources like coal and oil as part of the flood. Really, they are, you call them fossil fuels, but they really are evidence of past life, evidence of algae from mostly the oils, mostly marine algae that was buried rapidly. Coal, of course, is plants that was buried rapidly in the flood. But even the minerals, and God talks about the minerals before the flood. People were getting gold and silver and different minerals and using ores, building things out of metals. So he also made sure that there was going to be ample opportunities for that as well. And knowing that we would fill the earth with, roughly 7 or almost 8 billion people now. But there's plenty of, resources on our globe that I think as we fulfill that, but we've got to be careful not to overdo it. You can't rely on maybe just one thing all the time. You've got to also not go out and pollute. We used to just dump everything in the ocean, thinking the ocean's so big it won't matter. Well, we found out that we do that all over the world, and there are effects in the ocean. And so we really got to be stewards, like the Bible says, of the resources that God gave us. And so you can't just destroy everything in the process of extracting certain minerals. There is a little give and take. We need to be conscious of that, for society as a whole, but also for the future. Things just don't go away when you bury them in the ground. And so if there's hazardous waste, we've got to try to figure out how to take care of that as well. And so there's there's a little bit of give and take that, God allows us as humans, we've got smart enough brains to actually be able to use and control things of the earth. But there are obviously things we can't control that only God is in charge of as well. There's bigger things. And that, that's part of the problem with the whole climate change debate is, are we the only things, or is there a God behind it all that's preserving the earth as well? But even though God is preserving the earth to when he comes again, he's also gave us sort of in charge of these resources that are here. I think we've got to be, just like a farmer. You can't just farm once, you've got to be able to farm over and over and over. So we need to be stewards so that we can continually use these resources over and over and over as much as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Clary, for explaining the Dominion Mandate and being good stewards of the environment. And you as a research scientist are actually practicing the Dominion Mandate by trying to understand God's creation and then teaching what you learned on these geologic processes. Let's move on to the next question. In your presentation to the Twin Cities Creation Science Association in August, you explained the 6 mega sequences that occurred during the global flood. Please tell us where in the world you have seen these same 6 mega sequences in the same order that are laid down and from your research using these borehole strategic columns.
Well, there's a few places where you actually see all 6 in the same order. And there's, like the Tarim Basin in China, you see all 6, and you actually see an earlier, many places you don't see all 6. These waves kind of came in and then backed off and came in again and backed off. These big pulses of sediment that were deposited in the process left their mark, but there's also a little bit of erosion in between as well. And so we don't believe, of course, there was millions of years in between these mega sequences. We believe there was just days or maybe few days or few weeks at the most between some of these sequences, but these sediments, the waves kept coming in, and each time they got higher and higher, and we see different animals because of that. And we'll maybe get into that a little bit later as well. But we do see similar sequences on every continent I've examined so far, and that includes 5 continents now. So I finished up Asia recently. I don't know if I showed that for you guys in August. A little bit of the preliminary data in Asia shows almost the same story as we saw across Europe, Africa, South America, and North America. Again, most places you don't see all 6, but when you do see all 6, like the Williston Basin in North America, the Tarim Basin in Asia, I think there's a few other locations as well offhand. Recently, I've started working on New Guinea and Australia, and I see it in places in New Guinea, all 6 sequences, again, in the same order. And so we see a very similar pattern. It's a global pattern that can only be explained by a global process. And the Bible tells us clearly that global process was that global flood.
Well, this is great leading research that you're doing. My next question is sort of a broader question. As a geologist for private industry, a college professor in geoscience, and now an ICR research scientist, what have you learned from the mining and energy industry about the earth itself?
Well, the mining, and particularly oil and gas where I worked, they're on the cutting edge. They're always out there drilling, further and further offshore. And so the last 20 years, they've gone beyond where I used to work, even to deeper and deeper water. And they find things out there that are confirming not only the flood, but they find things they can't explain. But they don't really care because oil and gas people are looking for oil. They're looking for gas. So if they find oil and gas, they don't really care how old it is, even though they are bought into the paradigm of, old Earth. That's what you're taught as a geologist student. You're constantly bombarded with millions and billions of years. And so many of the Christian geologists out there are actually old Earth because that's all they can process. It's all they've been taught. And going from industry, I was always leaning towards young Earth because I read the early books by Henry Morris and Dwayne Gish and got to hear him speak at Western Michigan, because Dwayne Gish used to work for Upjohn, which was in Kalamazoo. And so he'd come back and speak periodically. So he was a great encouragement to me as well. But reading these earlier guys' works kept me kind of focused that there is evidence for a young Earth, evidence for, special creation of all these animals. They didn't just evolve from one to the other. And so looking back on everything I've seen, and particularly oil and gas, we see the practical side, even looking for minerals. The age of those minerals doesn't really matter as long as they're there. The age of coal doesn't matter as long as it's there. Same with oil and gas. And so they can say it's old, And we, of course, believe it's young, and the Bible tells us that. And there's more and more evidence stacking up showing that these minerals and rocks and oil and things have to be young or are young. But in their mind, they keep finding it anyway. And so what it's really allowed us to add more to the database. And that's really been a blessing to what I'm working on, because now there's all this area offshore all over these continents that's been drilled in the last 20 or 30 years. That it gives us more data to confirm that it really was a global flood.
By the way, Tim, I also worked for Upjohn.
Okay.
I've been to Kalamazoo many, many times.
Oh, yeah.
But I was never located there. I worked for a subsidiary called Asgrow Seed Company as an agronomist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of those guys. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a Pfizer now, right? Didn't Pfizer buy them out?
Yeah, it's part of Pfizer. Yeah, that whole complex there.
Yeah. But going back to the Dominion mandate, they polluted a lot. And they pump out more water to keep their pollution on their property. They pump out more water and have to process that water to clean it up before they can get rid of it, which is a good thing. We didn't always realize we were polluted, but they produce more water than the city of Kalamazoo uses every day out of just their piece of land there. And so that's part of our mandate. We're supposed to be good stewards. We got to clean up when we make a mess.
Right. So let me just summarize the last subject. The global flood of Noah's day is the reason for all the coal beds and oil and natural gas fields that we are finding in sedimentary layers laid down by water all around the world. And God has provided that energy needed to help support the 7.7 billion of people on this inhabited earth. All right, our next question. Please explain the Whopper sand phenomenon in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico when the waters of the worldwide flood after day 150, or what you call the receding phase, the Tejas, deposited this sand from the continent. And the Whopper sand deposit was found, from what I've read from you, about 20 years ago.
Yeah, they first drilled into it. Again, they started drilling deeper and deeper and deeper. And, our Chevron wasn't part of that really deep. They would stop at about 1,000 or 2,000 feet of water saying there's no sand out there, so what's the point? But Shell and BP were drilling further and further out, and they were expecting to find thin sands and then a lot of clay, thin sands and a lot of clay. They were just going to perforate the well over a bigger distance to try to get that production out. But they could see what's called bright spots on their seismic once they got the technology to get that far out and to drill that far out. So they were like, well, let's give it a try. And so they ran into the sand that they called the Whopper sand because they didn't know what else to call it because it was over 1,000 foot thick. It was almost pure sand. And they've drilled it in many locations now out in this deep water location, about 200 miles offshore and beyond. Really encompasses much of the deep Gulf of Mexico with this massive sand. And there's no secular or uniformitarian model to explain this sand that's really been accepted. They have a few kind of crazy ideas where they try to claim sea level might have dropped 6,000 feet in the Gulf of Mexico, but then it would fill in with groundwater from below unless you dropped all the ocean 6,000 feet. And there's no evidence of that. There's no salt deposits that you would expect to see, or gypsum deposits you would expect to see if there was all that evaporation. So even some of the secular scientists have said that doesn't work. So they really are at a loss to explain how you can get this huge, massive sand that covers such a large area in the deep Gulf, so many miles, 100 to 200 miles offshore. And recently they've expanded even more. They've drilled into it again, but they don't really care too much because they found close to 15 billion barrels of oil in it. And so if they're finding oil, they're like, we don't care where it came from. There it is. But they still believe, of course, it's millions of years old. But what's amazing about the Whopper sand is it's got a flat top and a flat bottom. And it's to a geologist, that tells you that this just came in one big mass. It doesn't slowly fine upward or coursing upward as you expect to see if you have a prograding sand that comes out. It's just boom, there it is. And so to me, it's at the base of the Tejas mega sequence, exactly where you'd expect to find sands. In this case, it's this massive sand that's offshore. What was happening in the world at the time, I believe, was the receding phase of the flood. And so this is that real high energy flow, the very beginnings of once the water was advancing, and then it rapidly changed direction. As it changed direction, it's like water going off a parking lot. You're going to get this massive high energy flow that's going to carry all these sands way out there, winnow them out, and deposit this big, thick sand. And I predict that offshore Africa, offshore Asia, different locations as I map out the offshore areas, you can see what areas that are really thick. And even off the Amazon, you can see the areas thicken up off the Amazon River today. And if they drill further out, maybe it's not economic, they'll probably find an equivalently sized Whopper sand out there. And so I believe this is part of the drainage of the flood. And you only see these types of sands at the bottoms of these mega sequences where you have this rapid change in direction. But in this case, it was the advancing water suddenly now all starts to recede. And I think that's the energy we need. After that, of course, it slowed down, so you get mostly clay. And that's what they were expecting when they drilled out there.
Thank you. I have a personal interest in the Whopper sands. Here's some data for the audience. In 2020, 14.6% of US crude oil and 5% of natural gas was produced from the wells located offshore in US federally administered waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And the great majority of that oil and gas are from these deep water wells.
It's actually to the geologists as to like the lower Wilcox sand, part of the Paleocene, they call it, which is the bottom of the Cenozoic. And that's exactly where you have the bottom of the Tejas mega sequence.
Our next question, where else in the world are there huge coal beds like the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana?
Well, the Powder River is unusual in some ways because you have stacked coals. They're like 6 or 8 at a time. And some of them are as thick as 200 foot thick, but a lot of them are about 100 foot to 80 foot thick. And they strip mine those. And most of our coal that we use in the country today comes from that Powder River area. I think about 40% of it are US coal that we use today. Even though coal's got a bad name with the current economic or the current political party in charge, it's still a wonderful resource and there's plenty of it. But what's amazing about those is they're stacked and they're about 60 miles by 60 miles in area. So each layer you can extend out. Many of them go 50, 60 miles in all directions. And so you've got these stacks, which again, I believe these are deposited in the receding phase of the flood in the Powder River. Now, other countries about the same time, you see thick sequences. Well, in Germany, you've got thick lignite. It's not really true coal. It hasn't been buried deep enough or got hot enough to become coal per se, but it's more of a lignite that they have. And that's hundreds of feet thick in places. In South America, some of their thickest coals I've discovered are also found in that Tejas or the Cenozoic, post-Cretaceous sediments as well. So there's much coal in thick deposits of coal, maybe not as extensive or stacked as thick, but sometimes even thicker. Individual beds even thicker if you add up that lignite. And one of the more amazing discoveries I made recently was studying Asia was you see there's all this coal offshore, 100 miles or more offshore, some of it in the South China Sea, which is in, 3,000 meters of water. When you're looking at 10,000 feet of water or more, and it's down about another mile below the surface. And it's all in that same Tejas mega sequence. So all this coal is way out there. It's offshore off of Russia, off Siberia, northern Siberia, into the Arctic Ocean. As you go out there, there's all this coal. The oil wells drill right through it, and they say, there's all this coal here. And so they're finding more and more of this coal, which I believe can only be explained by the receding phase of the flood, pushing that coal out, just like the Whopper sand. All this vegetation that was carried off the last highest ground areas were washed out there. So you see a different type of coal in the Powder River and in these Tejas coals, and you see in the earlier coals, they're a different type of plant because you're now stripping off, at least I believe, the highest elevations all over the world, transporting that material offshore. The secular scientists don't really have a good explanation for these coal beds offshore because they have to say they grew in place. They grew there, and then they somehow sank thousands of meters down, and then it had to rise again. I mean, it's all this yo-yoing going on, we call it, has to take place to explain them. But I haven't really seen much of an explanation of the coal beds off northern Siberia, or even a good explanation in the South China Sea and those areas off Vietnam. Lots and lots of coal that washed off the continent. It's just what you'd expect in a global flood that was going over the top of the continent, stripping all the vegetation off and transporting it around. So there's some amazing resources, again, that God provided, knowing that we would need these resources, the coal and oil as well, at this time in history. I mean, this was happened 4,400 years ago. Nobody was using coal much or oil until, to an extensive amount, until just recently, in the last 150 years. So
Very,
God's providence, even though the chaos of the judgment of the flood, gave us these resources that we can use. And again, we need to burn the coal cleaner. We need to burn these things so we don't pollute. Again, that's part of the Dominion mandate in some ways. We need to be good stewards of these resources as well.
In your presentation to Twin Cities Creation Science Association in August, you described runaway subduction and used evidence from imaging process called seismic tomography that shows 62-mile thick slabs of rock descending into the mantle of the earth. And these slabs of rock are colder than layers above. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think in some ways these are kind of it's hard to prove anything in geology because it's historical science. But to me, this is as close to proof as you can get that subduction was fast and it was recent, because these cold slabs, when they image them by the differences in density. And they show that these slabs stay almost the same temperature all the way down for hundreds of kilometers into the earth. Some of these go down as deep as the top of the core, and they still seem to be cold. They still have this look to them. You can go online and search, seismic tomography images of subduction zones, and you'll see all these images coming up all over the Pacific where all these subduction zones, still are. But today they're moving very, very slowly. And I think the tomography is confirming what John Baumgartner modeled back in the 90s. And he continues to show that there was a period of runaway subduction, that the mathematics that he put into his computer model would run once they reach a certain temperature, they would just start running away. And you would start getting these slabs of ocean crust, the original cold slabs of ocean crust would drop into the mantle at a real high rate of several miles per hour or several meters per second. And today, of course, once you used all the original ocean crust up, what's created is a newer, hotter crust at the ridges. And the hotter crust is more buoyant and it isn't as easily subducted. So what eventually happened is all the plates moved around. It used up all the original ocean crust, creating a new ocean crust, which we see even the secular community sees the ocean crust is new and young. And the oldest ocean crust goes back, I believe, to the Triassic, which would be the Absirica mega sequence, by halfway back to the flood record. And that's all you have. The continents have really old rocks. The oceans were kind of turned over as the flood progressed along. And I think that was the mechanism that God used to bring on the flood. And that's what I talk about in my book, Carved in Stone, that the more ocean crust you made, the more that buoyant crust pushed the water higher and higher. Andrew Snelling, my friend over at AIG, he did the math one time and estimated you have at least a million, or at least a mile of uplift, maybe a mile and a half of water. The whole ocean floor would rise a mile and a half with making a new seafloor very rapidly. And of course, since the flood, that ocean crust has cooled and has sank, and that helped to pull the water back as well. But I think this tomography has confirmed that there really is subduction that has occurred. Up until then, there's competing ideas about the mechanism. You got Walt Brown's ideas, you got other people's ideas, meteorite ideas. But to me, the seismic tomography is confirming that runaway or rapid subduction is the real, mechanism that was used. It really did happen. And the cold slabs, to me, show that it was just recently. Because if they were moving slowly, just a few inches per million years, those slabs would not still be cold way down deep in the mantle. They would have heated up by now. And so that's another conundrum, as we like to say, for the secular community that they really haven't been able to explain. And so they kind of ignore things they can't explain. And so they just say, oh, there's no way it could move fast. But 100 years ago, they would say there's no way the plates moved. But now they realize they move a few inches per year, which is they're doing now. But that's kind of the residual movement. During the flood, again, the tomography gives us not only evidence of subduction, but runaway subduction, real rapid subduction, pushing, these things just dropped into the mantle. And it's because they were cold and old. The original created crust seems to be, that's what was consumed, and this way you made a whole new crust in the ocean. And again, that whole new crust, by making that out of lava, heated the water up significantly and helped to bring on, of course, the ice age. But even the subduction zone volcanoes, by that subduction, some of that melt comes back up, and it makes a very explosive volcano. So it makes a different type of volcano than your average volcano across the ocean floor. It makes the Mount St. Helens type volcanoes, or the Mount Vesuvius, or the Mount Pinatubo, to put the aerosols in the atmosphere. So all these volcanoes are going off again towards the end of the flood. And I see this in my research, that the volcanic activity really starts to kick in the Zuni and in the Tejas mega sequence. And then I think during the Ice Age, there was tremendous volcanic activity as well, basically building the Cascade Mountains, building most of the mountains we see today out of volcanoes. And that contributed, that unique chemistry that's created at a subduction zone gives you the explosive volcanoes that you need for the Ice Age to come on. So you had hot oceans, have the new seafloor with a lot of evaporation, and you cool the Earth's atmosphere by the aerosols and the volcanic activity from the subduction zone volcanoes. And to me, that's one thing that some of the people that don't want to believe in plate tectonics, to them, it's the volcano is not just, every volcano is not the same. The subduction zone volcanoes also give us those aerosols that we need to bring on the Ice Age. And so it's kind of, it all seemed to fit. And that's why in my chapter, the last chapter of my book, it started coming to me like, it all makes sense. Some of this, what God did, this little bit of wisdom he's given me to see by looking at all this data, is starting to make sense in the big picture, that this is the mechanism, the rapid plate movement. It seems to be the mechanism that brought on the flood and also allowed the flood to go back into the oceans as the oceans cooled. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear, but it's very, very important, because it's, to me, tomography confirms that that's what happened. Now, unless you come up with a better theory in the future, to me, the best data seems to support that.
Well, thank God that we have this new process called tomography, that we can study the Earth that way. Now, in your one book, you wrote about dinosaurs. So this next question is about the dinosaur peninsula. How did that come about in the 11 Western states, 3 provinces in Canada? And how does that relate to the Genesis account?
Well, that came about because of the research that I was plotting the columns across North America. And if you plot up the columns and the oil well data across North America, you start seeing areas where there was a lot of thick sediments early. So the earliest sediments, Cambrian, which is the Sauk mega sequence, and Ordovician, Silurian, all those, the bottom part of the so-called geologic column was all deposited early, but it was all deposited east and west of what I call this dinosaur peninsula. Very little was deposited on that. So you can go to Royal Gorge, Colorado, and you'll see Jurassic rocks sitting right on top of the Precambrian basement. There's no early Cambrian Ordovician rocks there. And so that happens a lot. Secular scientists call this the ancestral Rockies. A lot of times they'll realize there's some sort of early uplift, but I think this was there all along. So as the waves came in, you started burying these shallow seas east and west of this kind of peninsula runs down the middle of North America. And you see these, like in my home state of Michigan, you see a lot of marine fossils. That's all you see, stacked marine fossils, and further out west as well, western Utah, that's what you see. But in between, you start to see that everything thins towards this ground, which when things thin, that means there was a hill there. And so there was this low, kind of a lowland type of hill, maybe even a lot of little islands and anastomosing little areas. We had a lot of swampy type terrain, maybe 1,000 foot or less above sea level. And I think that shows up in the rocks. You can plot up the earliest rocks, and then you see they thin. Then eventually you'll see in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, these areas were also covered. And so that's when the dinosaurs, I think, were being buried as the water got a little higher. But initially, it looks like you were just flooding shallow seas. And I can see this in Africa. I can see this in Asia, in Europe as well. You can see the areas that were flooded first by those first few sequences. They're all marine fossils, almost exclusively marine fossils. And then eventually you suddenly you have coal and land animals all show up at the same time in the same layers in the Abserica sequence, or Absaroka. And that's about the Pennsylvania, and that's why you get the so-called Carboniferous coals, but you also get land animals at the same time. So to me, you're now flooding the land. And recently, Jim Johnson and I wrote a paper in CRSQ that talks about Genesis 7. And we tied that to about day 40 of the flood, because that's when the ark starts to float. So we know we're flooding the land. So we think the first 3 sequences might have been those first 40 days. And then the Abserica kicks into gear about day 40 and beyond. And that's kind of where the Bible gives us some clues, and gives us some dates, but it doesn't give us as specific a data as we would like all the time, but it gives us enough. And so we can kind of put it on the framework of the biblical account, tie the geology to that. And and at least have some working models. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Very good. Let me summarize from the Bible then about the water.
Mhm.
Genesis 7:20, the water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. Genesis 7:23 says, thus he, that's God, blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky. They were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. Well, we're sort of running out of time. Are there any other things that you would like to share with the audience today?
Well, I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Maybe it's something I didn't emphasize in my book enough, and we put that in our recent CRSQ paper on Genesis 7 that Jim Johnson and I wrote. And that's the progression of the flood. That's what I really see. And I might not have emphasized that enough in my earlier talk, but it's really the progression matches exactly with what we see in the Bible. And we see the same progression starting out minimal flooding, then a little bit more, then a little bit more, a little bit more. You go from marine fossils early to suddenly land animals and these swampy areas like flooding the Dinosaur Peninsula. And then you get different coals early in the flood versus later in the flood where you get higher elevations. And the high elevations might have been 3,000, 4,000, maybe 5,000 feet. We didn't have most of the mountains that we have today. Those all formed as the floodwaters were receding. So 80% of the world's mountains kind of pop up as part of an isostatic rebound, which is another story in itself. But you didn't have the Himalayas, you didn't have the Andes, the Rockies. Those all formed as the floodwaters were starting to recede. But it's that progression that we see globally. Every continent shows the same progression. They all start out minimal, just marine fossils, and then you get a little more. And all of a sudden the land animals and the coal starts to show up. And then you get different land animals, different coal as you go up the progression. And it's always more and more and more. And but you see areas where there's no sediments today. And many of those areas were the highest hills, like Canada, Brazil, West Africa, Ukraine, different places, the Scandinavian area. Those areas, because the Bible tells us, as you read, 15 cubits over the highest hills. But the waves are going so fast, these tsunami waves generated by the rapid plate movement, I believe, that you stripped it right down to the crust. And so even if you try to build a boat, you'd get turned over and drowned if you weren't on that huge barge of an ark. And so these areas are stripped right down to the crust. Today, we see these areas, there's almost no sediment because 15 cubits is only about 23 feet. So you didn't leave a lot of sediment behind if the water was only 15 cubits high over the highest hills. And so after 4,400 years or so, there's been a lot of erosion. If you have 2-3 feet of sediment, it's going to erode away in that much time. So a lot of areas where the secular scientists say, well, it doesn't cover everything. Well, it did, but you got to read the biblical account to realize it didn't cover much sediment in those areas because you didn't have much water in those areas. And so that's one of the problems I like to complain about. The second thing that I'm still working on, trying to figure out, and I've been kind of writing a lot about, is where's the post-flood boundary? And there's a big debate in the geology community about that today. And I, unfortunately, go against a lot of the prevailing thoughts of some of my geology friends and colleagues who I love dearly, but I think the data supports a higher flood boundary, which is what Mike Ward's been pushing for many, many years. I think the flood boundary is probably up near the Tejas Zuni boundary, right about the end of the Cretaceous. To me, that seems to be the high point of the flood. But there's really only one rise in sea level, and I presented some of this at a secular conference. I showed the evidence on the continents. There's no evidence of an early rise. Like if you look at a textbook in geology, they'll show Cambrian Ordovician has real high sea level, and it went down and came back up again. But you don't see that. The rocks show one progression, minimal, get a little bit more, a little more, a little more. Then you reach a maximum about the end of the Cretaceous. And that seems to be where the floodwaters start to go down. So I interpret it differently than maybe a lot of other flood geologists. I think the data is supporting the receding phase beginning about the end of the Cretaceous. But again, that's stuff we're still trying to work out. But everybody, all my friends out there in the geologic community, we all agree it's a global flood 6,000 years ago. Walt Brown and I, we talked about subduction, whether it's happened or not, but we still agree on the big things. And the bottom line is, it's all about Christ. It all leads us back to Christ. That's where it all comes down to. The earth is created by Christ. Jesus, even though he wasn't known as Jesus at the time, he's part of the Trinity. He was there at the creation. He was there at the judgment of the flood, and he himself came to earth and gave himself up to be a sacrifice for the sins of all of us by shedding his blood, and then he rose again. Of course, he conquered death, and so we can get salvation not by walking through the door of an ark. We get salvation by going directly to Christ and accepting him as our Savior and asking him for forgiveness of our sins. And so, but that's even though we disagree on things, sometimes we lose sight of what we're really trying to get across, and that's we want people to come to Christ.
Thank you for sharing that gospel message here at the end of our podcast. I want to thank you, Dr. Clary, for your time and for the scientific explanations regarding the flood of Noah's day.